Now, there's been a lot of speculation with this film. A lot of people speculating which actors were playing what, which potential Avenger might be making an appearance, as well as what they were going to do with the villains, such as the Mandarin, as well as the introduction of AIM. So, a lot of things were really up in the air. A lot of people didn't really know what to make of it, especially given that they chose the Mandarin. Granted, he was one of the major villains in Iron Man's storylines, but not exactly the most politically correct choice. I mean, the Mandarin. Can you really think of any way that people could make the Mandarin into a not racially insulting type of villain? Well, let's dive right in as we begin this episode of Romney's Reviews. Now, the first thing that I have to say about this film is that it is a huge step up from Iron Man 2, like by leaps and bounds. Because my biggest problem with Iron Man 2 is that it just got weird, like with the editing and everything. I couldn't follow it. I had trouble gauging what was going on because a lot of the stuff just wasn't as clear. Now, I know there was a whole thing, oh yeah, it moved things forward, it expanded the cinematic universe. Yes, it expanded the cinematic universe, but it didn't really move the story forward, if that makes sense. I mean, it basically was essentially a world-building film, much like The Incredible Hulk. And so it was basically just saying, hey, we're establishing our universe, but it didn't really move things forward in the case of the characters. Now, I know it, like, yeah, but it introduced the romance between Tony Stark and Pepper Potts. It wasn't as progressive as, well, this film was. Because this film feels like a true sequel. Rather than being a world-building film, this film actually moves the story forward in terms of how the characters are developing and how they're reacting to what just happened, given that this film is set literally 1 year after the events of the Avengers. And, well, it's taken their toll on Tony Stark. I mean, the thing that really surprised me was how dark it almost kind of went in the sense of where Tony was almost going because of what was going on, and I liked it. It actually showed the character's humanity, which is really why I wish they didn't blow through a lot of the demon in the bottle storyline in Iron Man 2, because that would have been perfect for this film. Another thing I liked is that it did a much better job of introducing the villain and the other elements that you can tell are probably going to play a part in the later movies in Phase 2, particularly with the introduction of AIM. The way the Mandarin and AIM were introduced felt organic. It actually felt like, hey, this is actually part of the story, and not just say something to tell the audience to say, hey, look out for Avengers, because this is going to be important in Avengers. This was just a case of, look, this is a self-contained story. Because that's kind of how comics are and probably should be. Because the biggest problem with a lot of the Phase 1 stuff was that it was like trying to read comics as that were part of a major tie-in event where you have to constantly go to all the other books to get all the information. And even if you did choose to stick with a single character during the event, it relied too heavily on some of the other events. And so this film, it actually felt like it was a nice self-contained story. It introduced the elements in a way that kept it contained and wasn't trying to say, hey, this is stuff that's gonna play in later in the Avengers 2. It's just a case of, this is a self-contained story. These are the elements that are playing within that story and within that story only. Now, speaking of the Mandarin, I was really surprised with what they were able to do with such a potentially controversial villain. I mean, Ben Kingsley, really good actor, but when I heard that he was announced to play the Mandarin, I was kind of and then when I saw his design, I'm just like, okay, this is getting kind of uncomfortable territory. But then when I watched the film, they actually did a really good job with it, and they even did something that I didn't even expect, that actually found a way to make the Mandarin make sense, not only in the films of today, but in its own universe. The fact that Robert Downey Jr.'s contract is expiring with Marvel and they're currently renegotiating had a distinct effect on the film, which I think actually played to its advantages because it ended on a very conclusive note without completely shooting itself in the foot. Best way to describe the ending is that it ends on a note that says, hey, if we stopped here, we end on a high note. But if we make more, we make more. And that's what it felt like. It felt like a case of, hey, if we can't get Robert Downey Jr. back, we at least end on a high note, on a really strong note, as opposed to ending on a downer like other films might have. Story stuff aside, the visuals of this film are also a step up from the original because the editing, especially the editing, has a nice pace to it. There were a few hiccups here and there, but it wasn't as bad as, well, Iron Man 2 or other films I've seen this year. It actually had a nice pace to it. They knew what they were doing. If you haven't guessed by my essential fanboy raving of it, I had a blast watching this film. I mean, it was incredible. I actually kind of liked it better than the Avengers because it felt like a movie. It felt like a more self-contained story. Granted, the Avengers was awesome, but this film, it built things up and actually had some really cool moments and really moved things forward in terms of the actual character development. And it really benefited from the fact that it was focusing solely on Iron Man rather than trying to focus on a whole bunch of other characters at once. It focused on the characters that were strictly in Iron Man's storyline, particularly Tony Stark, whoever Don Cheadle plays, and Pepper Potts. If you're a fan of the superhero movies, particularly of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you're gonna have a wonderful time watching it. I don't recommend watching it in 3D, mostly because, well, it's pointless and I don't want it. And you really shouldn't have to spend an extra $2 or $3, or in some cases $5, to see something in 3D when the film is still enjoyable in 2D. So yeah, this should come as probably no real surprise, but on my personal scale, I give Iron Man 3 a 5 out of 5. So that's it for this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. Coming from a high point, this next film will have me doing battle with a filmmaker that I absolutely despise. Next week is The Great Gatsby. See you then.